Hi friends, my name's Naomi. Welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to be talking about Hispanic Heritage Month and some recommendations and some books that I want to prioritize for the month of Hispanic Heritage Month. So if you don't know, Hispanic Heritage Month runs from September 15th to October 15th. It's not like the start of end of one month, but it's September to October. But yeah, if you've been here for a while, you know that I made a video just like this last year. So I am attempting to not repeat books from that video. So if you want even more recommendations for books that you should read during Hispanic Heritage Month, you can always go watch that video as well. I'll make sure to link it down below. But yeah, if you've been around, you know that I'm Puerto Rican. I lived in Puerto Rico for about 13 years and I moved here to the United States back in 2012. So I want to start off by saying that obviously I'm not like the perfect Hispanic person. Last year when I made the video, I used the word Latinx, and I used to use that word like in everyday life. I did see some comments from people saying that that word was offensive and stuff, so I did a little research. I'm gonna leave the article down below of the difference between Latinx and Latine. So if you notice, I probably used the word Latine for the title of the video. It's just more respectful to the Spanish language. Like I said, I'll leave the article down below, but pretty much Latinx was made by a person whose first language is English, and obviously it's a word for the Spanish language, so it doesn't really make sense sometimes, the word Latinx, and Latina is much easier for people that speak Spanish to use. So that is the my understanding behind that. And again, like I want to say, I am obviously not the perfect Hispanic person. It's hard when you're like one of the few people, like for example for me, one of the few like Puerto Rican booktubers. I know there's a lot, don't get me wrong, I know there's a lot of Hispanic booktubers in the community, but it's hard when you're one of them, because I feel like people always expect you to be perfect and know everything about it. In my everyday life, I work in nonprofit and I'm like a board member for certain boards, and I'm like the only Hispanic person, and I feel like I have to be the voice of this huge population, and I don't know it all. I know mostly about my experience as a Puerto Rican woman. So yeah, obviously I'm not perfect, and here on BookTube it's really hard because I feel like people expect you to be perfect 24/7, and people make mistakes, and please know that I'm always open to being educated, and if I make a mistake or I do something that makes you feel some type of way or that may come off a certain way, please tell me. I'm always open for a conversation, to being educated. I don't really believe in cancel culture. I feel like we don't really know what's going on in everyone's life, and they may just need educating and they can fix their mistakes. But yeah, I feel like in booktube communities sometimes, like with cancel culture and everything, has been so big that people just treat others as very disposable, and I feel like that's really hurtful. But yeah, with all of that out of the way, first I'm going to talk about some books that I've read that I recommend, and then I'm going to talk about the books that I want to read during Hispanic Heritage Month. So of course, I'm going to start with one of my favorite authors, and I mentioned her in the video that I did last year, and that is Elizabeth Acevedo. She's written a couple, I think she's written a couple more than these 3 books. Can't remember. This might be all her backlist. But yeah, Elizabeth Acevedo is amazing. I love her. She has, The Poet X was one of the first books that she ever came out with. This one is written in verse, and it's really beautifully written. And it's pretty much about this young girl who's like in high school, and she wants to join the Poetry Slam Club, but her family is very conservative and they are very religious and they don't really believe in all of that. So it's kind of her and writing her poetry and her frustrations and all of that, and just like finding more about herself beyond like the religion that her parents have taught her. Again, this book is beautifully written. I would probably start with this one because, like I said, it's written in verse, so it's a pretty easy, quick read. And then my favorite Elizabeth Acevedo is With the Fire on High, and this one follows a young teen mom whose dream is to become a chef, and she wants to enroll in this program in her school for like cooking, and you get to travel abroad and all these things. But obviously with being a single teen mom, there's a lot of hardships with that. Again, even though this one is like this is her first like actual novel and it's not written in verse, it's still beautifully written. There's a whole bunch of like recipes, and the food descriptions are amazing, and also this cover is just so beautiful. But yeah, this is my favorite, Elizabeth Acevedo. And then also I have Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo, and this one, is this one written in verse? Yeah, this one is written in verse also, kinda. There's some parts where there are like actual paragraphs, but it's mostly written in verse. And this one follows these two half-sisters, and their father passed away in like a flight accident. Like he was flying somewhere and the plane crashed, and basically these two half-sisters don't know much about each other, but after their father passes away, they try to connect. It's a really, really beautiful story as well. And the next author that I'm going to recommend, I will say I'm going to mention my favorite book by her, because there are other books that I read by her that I don't love, but I know that a lot of other people do, so I wanted obviously to mention her, and that is Silvia Moreno Garcia. And my favorite book by her is Velvet Was the Night. I know that a lot of people's favorite is Mexican Gothic. I didn't really personally love that book as much, and I can't remember if I've read more by her, but I do have a book by her in my TBR for this book. But this one is a very, very atmospheric book. This one is set in the 1970s in Mexico City, and it follows this woman, I believe her name, yes, Maite, and she's a secretary. And then one day one of her neighbors in her apartment complex like asks her to take care of her cat for a couple days, and then after a couple days go by, this lady never returns, and then this whole adventure of her trying to figure out what happened to her neighbor starts. And there is a different point of view as well in this book. I don't want to say much about it because I really enjoyed reading it without knowing what was going on, so I'm gonna let you figure that out. But yeah, I really, really love this book. And also our main character, she's unlikable, I will say, but I had a really fun time reading about her because it was just so interesting to me. And this is a noir type of book, so yeah, I really love this one. The next book that I have is also another author that has a whole bunch of books out, and one of her other books is also on my TBR, and that is The Inheritance of Arcadia Divina by Zoraida Cordova. I read this book, I believe, last year. It was after Hispanic Heritage Month, so that's why it wasn't in my video last year, but I adored this book. This one is about this big family, and this one follows people that are from Ecuador. I think Equatorian is the word. But yeah, it follows this huge family. It's like a multi-generational type of story, and they're very secretive. This book is kind of like magical realism, and their grandmother, Orquídea Divina, she is slowly dying, and she invites her whole family over to her house to kind of have them collect their inheritance. And then she begins telling the story of her life from the day that she was born and all of these different things that have happened in her life. So I really loved it. I loved this type of story. If you've ever read The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender, this book is very much like that one too, but Hispanic culture. The next book that I read this year, and it's one of my favorite books of the year, and that is Ophelia After All by Raquel Marie. This one is about a really cute girl, and her name is Ophelia, and she's Cuban, and she's going through high school and through all of the changes, and she loves roses. She has a little garden. She has this cool group of friends. This book reminded me a lot of Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda and like that friend group. And this book is also queer, so throughout the novel you see that she develops a crush for the first time ever on a girl, and usually her family thinks that she's like boy crazy, but yeah, it's really cute. It's very YA, like high school drama. It's one of my favorites of the year. I truly love this book. And the last book that I'm going to recommend, once again, I have this author repeated in my TBR for this month, and that is Chanel Clayton, and she wrote The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba. And this one is a historical fiction novel that is set in the late 1800s, and it's during the Spanish oppression, and it follows a journalist, and this journalist going after the story of this beautiful woman in Cuba, she's very young. She's like 18 years old, and she has been arrested and put in like one of the worst jails for like women in Cuba, and people just can't believe it because she's so beautiful, and she comes from like this rich family. And it kind of talks about the story of how the Spanish oppression made its way into American journalism, and how people actually started caring about like the Spanish oppression in Cuba and all of that because of this beautiful woman. So there are really interesting conversations in here. There's romance, historical fiction. Really like this book. So yeah. Oh no, I forgot. There's a book that I don't own physically, and that is Blaze Wrath Games by Amparo Ortiz. And this one follows a Puerto Rican young girl, and her dream is to go in the Olympics for like dragon riding. So obviously this is a fantasy novel, and this one reminds me a lot of like Amari and the Night Brothers and like that type of fantasy books. Sorry to make this comparison, but this one reminded me a lot of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire aesthetic, I guess, with like the games and like all of these little trials and stuff that they have to go through with young people and like different countries or different teams, and it has dragons, and it's really cool. And the coolest part for me was also reading about her experience as a Puerto Rican young woman in this. So it was like reading, it was very nostalgic because it felt like reading like an old fantasy book, but with a Puerto Rican main character, and I loved it. Alright, so now I can go on to the books that I want to read for the month of Hispanic Heritage Month. Okay, so the first book that I have is a poetry collection, and that is Anto Dogs by Stephanie Genese. I know Stephanie Genese personally. I used to work with her when I worked at a Latino Arts and Culture Center. Basically, we gave out these like grants of money, and this was her project, so I was really excited to have this for Hispanic Heritage Month. So yeah, like I said, this is a poetry collection. I can link down below if you want to get your hands on this. So this one pretty much is about the birth control trials that happened in Puerto Rico to Puerto Rican women like a long time ago. This poetry collection talks a lot about reproductive rights and obviously brings in Puerto Rican women and the birth control trials and all of that. So yeah, I'm really excited to read this. It seems like it's going to be a very feminist book about the history of like the feminine body and colonial powers and all of that, so I'm really excited. So like I said, I did have some repeats from the authors that I've mentioned earlier, and the next book that I have is The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and this is Silvia Moreno Garcia's most recent release. This, I thought it was gonna be like fantasy-ish. I think it might be, but it's also sci-fi, I've heard, so I'm a little nervous. And this is a retelling of the story of the island of Dr. Moreau. And I know there have been like other books that have come out that are retellings of that story. I don't think I know much about it. I just know it's mainly like kind of like a Frankenstein, but with animals in like a remote island. I think that's what the story is pretty much about. So from reading the inside of this, it seems like it's gonna follow 3 different perspectives. The daughter of Dr. Moreau, who's obviously the daughter of like this doctor who may be a genius or a madman. And then it looks like, let me read his name, Montgomery Lofton, who is going to be like the apprentice to the doctor, and I'm assuming there's gonna be a romance between the daughter and the and the apprentice. And then the last like little blurb at the bottom, it says the hybrids, and I'm assuming that this is like what the doctor is creating. So I'm really interested to see if these hybrids get like an actual POV in this book. But I am really interested in reading this because it said that it's set in like a remote and luxuriant estate, and I'm living. This looks like it's gonna be really good, but we'll see, because I feel like Silvia Moreno Garcia for me is very hit or miss. So I'm hoping that this is a hit. A book that I have on here, it's probably been on my TBR for the longest time, and that is They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. Again, this book has been on my TBR since the day it came out, which was back probably in like 2016 or 2017. But pretty much from the title, you can see that they both die at the end. And this is kind of like a futuristic book that there is an app that tells you the day that you're gonna die, like how many hours you have left. and they basically pair you up with someone else who's also going through the same thing so you don't die alone. And this is obviously a romance story and is queer, and it's about these two boys, Mateo and Rufus, and I'm assuming they have like 24 hours to live and they fall in love during these 24 hours. And I'm really excited. This is going to become either a movie or TV show. I'm not sure. I haven't been too up to date with the adaptations, so yeah, but I'm excited to read it and then watch it. Another book that I don't have with me physically, I actually ordered it and I still haven't gotten it in the mail. I thought that I would by today, but that is Blanca and Roja, and I think this one is by Anna Marie McLemore, but I could be wrong. And this is like a Snow White retelling, and I'm really excited because I usually really love like retellings of stories. And for Snow White, I feel like I've only ever read Scarlet by Marissa Meyer, which is in that Lunar Chronicles series. But yeah, I'm really excited for this one, and I've heard that this one is also sapphic, so I'm really hoping that it is and that it's amazing. Next up, I have another poetry collection. Now that I'm flipping through this, this is not a poetry collection. This is Her Body and Other Parties, and actually I think this is like a short story collection, so there's a whole bunch of little short stories in here. So this one's another very feminist book, and all of these little short stories tackle a different genre, so like science fiction, horror, comedy, fantasy, and there are all these little tiny short stories that have to do with the realities of women's lives and violence and their bodies and all of that. So you know that I'm excited to read this book. I read In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, and I had a book club discussion. It was like here in Cleveland, and it was just such a good discussion. So I'm really excited to read this one and discuss with somebody that has read it. Oh, this was a present from my friend Isabel, so maybe I can talk about it with her. Alright, next up I have Next Year in Havana by Chanel Clayton. So again, I think this is kind of like a companion to The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba. I've heard that all of her books are kind of like related to each other somehow. So this is a historical fiction novel, and it's set in Cuba, in Havana. It looks like this one's gonna have two different timelines, one set in the 1950s and one in 2017. Seems like her stories kind of have that trend that it follows like one person who is a journalist kind of researching this story, and then the actual story that was set in like the 1900s. So yeah, I'm really excited to read it. Historical fiction. Yeah. Alright, so next up I have Labyrinth Loss by Zoraida Cordova, and again, like I mentioned, I was going to be doing some repeat authors, and obviously Zoraida Cordova wrote The Inheritance of Arcadia Divina, and this one is pretty much about this girl who, her name is Alex, and she is a bruja, but she hates being a bruja. So on like her death day celebration thing, she casts a spell so she can get rid of her powers, but in doing that she actually makes her family vanish. So in order to fix this, she needs the help from this boy, and his name is Nova, and she feels like she can't really trust him, but he's like her only chance at bringing her family back. This one sounds really cute actually. I am really hoping though that the writing is similar to The Inheritance of Arcadia Divina, because that was one of the things that I loved about the book, was the beautiful flowery writing. So I'm hoping that this one also has that, but I think that this one is more YA than The Inheritance of Arcadia Divina. Alright, last couple of books here. I swear I have like 5 different copies. Well, I used to have 5 different copies of this book. I had like 3 arcs, and then I had a paperback, and I gave that away to somebody because I also had a hardback that I'm about to show, and then they just came out with a new cover with a paperback. So anyway, I have When We Make It by Elizabeth Velasquez. This came out last year, and they just sent me this gorgeous cover, which I honestly really love. This one is also written in verse, so I'm really excited to read this one because I feel like it's gonna have some really beautiful passages, and I feel like I'm gonna relate to this book a lot because this book follows our main character. Her name's Sarai, and she's Puerto Rican, but she lives in New York. So I think she was born in New York City, so she is what she calls herself, a New Yorican. And I guess she's like the first generation like question asker, so like she's always questioning things and how all of these things that she's been taught to believe, she's always asking questions. She's very curious, and I feel like she's one of those first people that is kind of straying away from some of the like Hispanic generational things that we are taught to believe, and I'm very much like that too, so I'm really excited to read this. Yeah, so it seems like she's going to be navigating family trauma and masculinity in its most toxic form. Machismo in Hispanic culture is very, very real. So yeah, it seems like she's going to be questioning all of the systemic pressures of life and how she's been raised and all of that, and that is very much like me, so I'm really excited to read this one. Alrighty, and the last book that I have is Lovisona by Romina Garber. So this one follows our main character Manuela, and she is an undocumented immigrant and she lives in Florida, and basically her family gets arrested by ICE and she starts investigating from the only clue that she has about her past, which I'm assuming it'll have to do with her father, because they mention her mother on here, like on the back of this they mention that her mother is arrested, but they don't really mention her father, so I'm assuming the only clue that she has from her past is from her father's side of the family, and she starts investigating that, which leads her to a secret world buried within our own. So it seems very City of Bones. World straight out of Argentine folklore, where the 7th consecutive daughter is born a bruja and the 7th consecutive son is a lobizón, which is a werewolf. So this sounds really excited with witches and werewolves and all of that, and also the whole thing with undocumentation and immigration and ICE and all of that. I feel like it's going to be really interesting to read about. Ooh, that's a really powerful line. On back here it says, she learns it's not just her US residency that's illegal, it's her entire existence. Whoa. Alrighty friends, so those are all of the books that I want to recommend, all of the books that I'm hoping to read during Hispanic Heritage Month. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please let me know if you're planning on picking any of these books up during Hispanic Heritage Month. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed again, and I will see you next time. Bye!